The personal versus the impersonal. Because the right hemisphere sees nothing in the abstract, but always appreciates things in their context, it is interested in the personal, by contrast with the left hemisphere, which has more affinity for the abstract or impersonal. The right hemisphere's view of the world in general is construed according to what is of concern to it, not according to objective impersonal categories, and therefore has a personal quality. This is both its strength and its weakness in relation to the left hemisphere. It deals preferentially with whatever is approaching it, drawing near, into relationship with it. The right temporal lobe deals preferentially with memory of a personal or emotionally charged nature, what is called episodic memory, where the left temporal lobe is more concerned with memory for facts that are in the public domain. Interestingly, the right hemisphere's concern with the personal past may be directly linked to something else we will come to, its tendency towards feelings of sadness. The living versus the non-living. The great neurologist François Lermite drew attention 35 years ago to an essential difference between the hemispheres, when he described a case which confirmed that the right hemisphere is more concerned with living individuals than man-made objects. This flows naturally from its interest in whatever it is that exists apart from ourselves, and its capacity for empathy, as well as from its capacity to see the whole, where the left hemisphere sees an agglomerate of parts. There is an intuitive relationship between cutting things up and depriving them of life. It is the left hemisphere alone that codes for non-living things, while both hemispheres code for living things, perhaps because the living can be seen as independent individuals, right hemisphere, or as objects of use, prey, things, and so on, left hemisphere. However, at least one study has found a clean divide between the hemispheres, the left coding for the non-living, and the right for the living, regardless of the task. Another study concluded that there are different brain networks observing the identification of living and non-living entities. Food, however, and musical instruments, presumably because of the intimate way in which they take part in the life of the body, sort with the living rather than the non-living. The body as such is a right hemisphere entity, whereas body parts are the province of the left hemisphere. In fact, when a right hemisphere is no longer available to bring the left side of the body into being, the left hemisphere may substitute only a mechanical structure of inanimate parts down that side. One patient described by Ehrenwald reported that, following a right hemisphere stroke, where the left half of his chest, abdomen and stomach should be, he's got only a wooden plank. It goes right down to his anus, and is divided into compartments by transverse planks. Food doesn't follow the usual path from the stomach through the intestines. It gets sucked into the compartments of this scaffolding and it falls through the hole at the bottom of the framework. This is only on the left side. On the right, the organs are all perfectly in place. And Ehrenwald records that it was not just a delusional idea, but a percept. He could see and feel the plank. Not only does the right hemisphere have an affinity with whatever is living, but the left hemisphere has an equal affinity for what is mechanical. The left hemisphere's principal concern is utility. It is interested in what it has made, and in the world as a resource to be used. It is therefore natural that it has a particular affinity for words and concepts, for tools, man-made things, mechanisms, and whatever is not alive. The left hemisphere codes for tools and machines. References to tools and actions of grasping activate the left hemisphere even in left-handers. Despite the fact that they habitually use the right hemisphere, left hand to grasp objects and use tools in daily life, and right hemisphere damage leaves the ability to use simple tools unaltered, whereas left hemisphere damage renders the sufferer incapable of using a hammer and nail, or a key and a padlock. However, right hemisphere damage particularly impairs naturalistic actions involving a sequence of steps, for example, making a cup of coffee or wrapping a present. Could one go so far as to say that the left side represents science and the right side nature? Although I have myself expressed skepticism over the popular dichotomies associated with the two sides of the brain, I think there is a case for supposing that the left side represents the fruits of human invention, including language, manufacture, and a partwise way of representing objects. So writes Michael Corballis, in the context of a tribute to Roger Sperry, both major contributors to our understanding of the hemispheres, and both alike skeptics of the popular dichotomies. He draws attention to the affinity of the left hemisphere for everything it has itself made, the fruits of human invention, in contrast to the affinity of the right hemisphere for what exists before and after, and beyond ourselves, namely nature. I would not accept the term science, in the true sense of the word, as applying to the left hemisphere. Much of the spirit of empiricism comes from the right hemisphere, as I will suggest when considering scientific discovery during the period of the Renaissance. And science does not always proceed by predictable paths, it is more fortuitous, less controlled, than the left hemisphere thinks, and involves open awareness of what is. Perhaps Corballis would not accept it either, as he does not answer his own question. But if one were to substitute the word mechanism, and, alas, so much science can be mechanistic, I would be in complete agreement. The right temporal region appears to have areas not only specific for living things, but additionally for all that is specifically human. Such judgments of humanness are separate from the right hemisphere's superior ability to recognize faces. The right hemisphere prioritizes whatever actually is, and what concerns us. It prefers existing things, real scenes and stimuli that can be made sense of in terms of the lived world, whatever it is that has meaning and value for us as human beings. It is more able to assimilate information from the environment, without automatically responding to it, and, possibly as a result, the developing right hemisphere is more sensitive to environmental influences. At the same time, the left hemisphere is more at home dealing with distorted, non-realistic, fantastic, ultimately artificial images. This may be because they invite analysis by parts, rather than as a whole. But it does appear that the left hemisphere has a positive bias towards whatever is bizarre, meaningless or non-existent. Though the data here are particularly hard to interpret because most studies have not sufficiently distinguished confounding elements. The fact that, while things are still present in their newness, as individually existing entities, not represented as representatives of a category, they belong to the right hemisphere, can be seen in the light of this distinction between the living and the non-living, since as they become overfamiliar, inauthentic and therefore lifeless, they pass to the left hemisphere. Empathy and theory of mind. Because of the right hemisphere's openness to the interconnectedness of things, it is interested in others as individuals, and in how we relate to them. It is the mediator of empathic identification. If I imagine myself in pain, I use both hemispheres, but your pain is in my right hemisphere. The same neurons in the right anterior cingulate cortex, an area known to be associated with the appreciation of pain, show activity whether we ourselves are hurt or we witness someone else undergoing a similar painful experience. Self-awareness, empathy, identification with others, and more generally intersubjective processes, are largely dependent upon right hemisphere resources. When we put ourselves in others' shoes, we are using the right inferior parietal lobe and the right lateral prefrontal cortex, which is involved in inhibiting the automatic tendency to espouse one's own point of view. In circumstances of right hemisphere activation, subjects are more favorably disposed towards others and more readily convinced by arguments in favor of positions that they have not previously supported. In general, the right hemisphere is critical for making attributions of the content, emotional or otherwise, of another's mind, and particularly in respect of the affective state of another individual. According to Simon Baron Cohen, The right hemisphere is engaged even in listening to words describing the mind, such as think and imagine. But the right hemisphere will empathize with, identify with, and aim to imitate only what it knows to be another living being, rather than a mechanism. A point of interest in view of the roles we have seen the two hemispheres play in the division of the world into the animate and the inanimate. When we look at either a real hand or a virtual reality hand grasping an object, we automatically activate the appropriate left hemisphere areas, as if we too were grasping. But, strikingly, only in the case of the real, living hand do regions in the right temporoparietal area become activated. We have an unconscious, involuntary urge to imitate someone we are watching carrying out an action, so much so that, especially if it's something we've practiced ourselves, the empathic entrainment is actually stronger than the voluntary desire to do something we'd like to see happen. But this is true only if we think it is a real person that's acting. If we think it's a computer, we just are not engaged. The right hemisphere plays an important role in what is known as theory of mind, a capacity to put oneself in another's position and see what is going on in that person's mind. This capacity emerges in primates along with self-recognition and self-awareness, and is closely linked to it. It is a capacity that children do not acquire fully until the age of 4, though elements are probably present from 12 to 18 months, and which autistic children never acquire. The classic test for theory of mind shows two dolls, Sally and Anne, playing with a marble. They put it away in a box, and leave the room. While Sally is out, Anne returns, plays with the marble and puts it away in a different box. The question is, when Sally returns, where will she look for the marble? Those without capacity for theory of mind indicate the new box where they know the marble to be, not the original one where Sally last saw it placed. The right hemisphere has by far the preponderance of emotional understanding. It is the mediator of social behavior. In the absence of the right hemisphere, the left hemisphere is unconcerned about others and their feelings. Social intercourse is conducted with a blanket disregard for the feelings, wishes, needs and expectations of others. Patients with right frontal deficits, but not left frontal deficits, suffer a change of personality whereby they become incapable of empathy. Considerable interest has been raised by the discovery that there are neurons, nicknamed mirror neurons, which are active both when we do something and when we watch others do it. Physiological and behavioral evidence indicated that the left pars opercularis, part of Broca's area, the area of the frontal lobe critical for speech production, contains mirror neurons which are involved in the imitation of finger movements. So absorbing was this finding, which is indeed highly significant, and which I will discuss in the next chapter, that it was until recently thought that mirror neurons were a specialty of the human left hemisphere, and their existence has even been put forward as a reason for languages having developed in the left hemisphere, rather than the right. But that seems a bit like putting the cart before the horse, especially since both the left and right pars opercularis equally have mirror neurons, and both hemispheres contribute to the processing of watching and imitating. In fact, which hemisphere is involved on any one occasion has not only to do with what and where the action is that we are copying, but also with how instrumental, object-directed, that action is. Such actions excite the left hemisphere system. On the other hand, the predominant contribution to the imitation of actions that are non-instrumental comes from the right temporal and frontal lobes. Mirror neurons are a means of understanding another's intentions, amongst other things, and are not just about copying actions. They form part of our capacity to understand others and empathize with them. For instance, in imitating other people's facial expressions, it is the right pars opercularis, with its mirror neurons, which is the critically important area, and it is this area that appears to be silent in autistic children when carrying out such a task. Emotional asymmetry. The affinity of the right hemisphere with emotions and the bodily experience of them is reflected in a range of functional asymmetries. Part of the right frontal pole of the brain, the so-called orbitofrontal cortex of the right hemisphere, is essential to emotional understanding and regulation. It is also where the emotional significance of events is consciously appreciated. The right hemisphere is in general more intimately connected with the limbic system, an ancient subcortical system that is involved in the experience of emotions of all kinds, and with other subcortical structures, than is the left hemisphere. The right frontal pole also regulates the hypothalamic pituitary axis, which is the neuroendocrine interface between the body and emotion, and is essential to our subjective appreciation of the body's physiological condition. It is intimately connected with the unconscious and automatic systems for regulating the body and its level of arousal, for example through the autonomic control of heart rate or neuroendocrine function. As a consequence, it is also the right frontotemporal cortex that exerts inhibitory control over emotional arousal. Although there has been much debate about the particular emotional timbre of each hemisphere, of which more shortly, there is evidence that in all forms of emotional perception, regardless of the type of emotion, and in most forms of expression, the right hemisphere is dominant. Emotional receptivity. It is the right hemisphere that identifies emotional expression. It is faster and more accurate than the left hemisphere in discriminating facial expression of emotion. Specifically, the right superior temporal sulcus appears to be involved in recognition of facial emotion. The right hemisphere is the locus of interpretation, not only of facial expression, but of prosody, vocal intonation, and gesture. The superiority for emotional perception is in addition to, and distinct from, the right parietal lobe's known superiority for visuospatial interpretation. Those with right hemisphere damage have difficulty understanding emotional intonation or implication. Curiously, it seems that the left hemisphere reads emotions by interpreting the lower part of the face. Though the left hemisphere can understand emotional display, it looks not at the eyes, even when directed to do so, but at the mouth. The right hemisphere alone seems to be capable of understanding the more subtle information that comes from the eyes. Empathy is not something one reads in the lower face, where relatively blunt messages, friend or foe, tend to be conveyed. A patient of mine with a right temporoparietal deficit asked me what's all this with the eyes. When I asked what she meant, she explained that she had noticed people apparently communicating coded messages with their eyes, but could not understand what they were, presumably because the part of her brain that would have interpreted it was no longer functioning. Further grounds for paranoia in those who have to rely on their left hemisphere to constitute the world. When it comes to the understanding and expression of emotion in language, again, despite left hemisphere preponderance for language, the right hemisphere is superior. Emotional language may be possible even when speech is lost through a left hemisphere stroke. It is the right hemisphere that understands the emotional or the humorous aspect of a narrative. Memory for emotional language is in the right hemisphere. Ultimately, there is clear evidence that when it comes to recognizing emotion, whatever it may be, whether it is expressed in language or through facial expression, it is the right hemisphere on which we principally rely. The face is the common mediator of two of the most significant aspects of the right hemisphere's world, the uniqueness of the individual and the communication of feeling. The right hemisphere is involved in identifying not just the facial expression of emotion, but the emotion as it relates to an individual face. This begins in children and is the principal medium for the child's growing sense of identity, through interaction with the mother's face. It is also in the right parieto-temporal cortex that the child appreciates the mother's voice. Because of its concern with our embodied selves, our feelings, and the feelings and intentions of others, as well as their uniqueness, It could be anticipated that it is through the right hemisphere that emotional faces are stored in memory. In fact, it is the right hemisphere that is principally responsible for our ability to identify and remember faces at all. The capacity would seem to us quite extraordinary if we were not so close to it and so familiar with it. Faces are broadly similar complex three-dimensional structures that have to be distinguished from one another by often minutely differing interrelations amongst the parts of the whole, which, nonetheless, can change with facial expression from second to second, and individually discriminated in differing orientations, at varying distances, in different lighting conditions, often while moving, and in a fraction of a second. It is amazing that we can do it at all. An inability to recognize faces is called prosopagnosia, and follows right hemisphere lesions. What the right hemisphere crucially appears to be able to do here is to see the configurational aspects of the whole. In prosopagnosia, this capacity is lacking. In fact, in its absence, the left hemisphere has to rely on the laborious process of trying to put the face together from the parts, with the paradoxical effect that it may find it no easier to recognize a face the right way up than upside down, and may even find it easier upside down, because such views force a concentration on the parts. There is a critical role here for the right middle fusiform gyrus, but latterly it has become clear that the network underlying facial recognition is broadly distributed in the right hemisphere. Right brain-damaged patients are not only poorer at identifying faces, compared with left brain-damaged patients, but are poor at assessing such features as the age of a face with which they are not familiar. The right hemisphere is preeminent, not only in identifying an individual human face, and in interpreting its emotional expression, but in appreciating its age, sex, and attractiveness. It was one of Wiggins' achievements to have recognized prosopagnosia in 1844, but it took another 100 years for it to be given a name. In 1947, Joachim Bodemer described a patient who reported that faces seemed to him strangely flat, white with emphatic dark eyes, as if made from a flat surface, like white oval plates, all alike. The lack of depth is very interesting for reasons I will come to. Prosopagnosia was linked to right hemisphere lesions by Sargent and Villamure, who recognized that there was an inability to combine the component features into a configurational facial representation that would uniquely define each face. Putting together the parts could not achieve a unique whole. It is also remarkable that once again there is a specific defect for recognition of eyes, in some cases, presumably because the left hemisphere, with its interest in the lower part of the face, steps into the breach. Subjects with partial prosopagnosia following a right hemisphere lesion have been able to glean evidence from the mouth area, but were quite unable to use information from the eyes. The superiority of the right hemisphere for recognizing faces is yet another lateralized difference that goes a considerable way down the evolutionary chain. For example, it is even present, believe it or not, in sheep, who can remember individual human and sheep faces after a gap of years, again relying principally on the right hemisphere. Emotional expressivity. As well as emotional recognition, the right hemisphere plays a vital role in emotional expression, via the face or the prosody of the voice. The right frontal lobe is of critical importance for emotional expression of virtually every kind through the face and body posture. The one exception to the right hemisphere superiority for the expression of emotion is anger. Anger is robustly connected with left frontal activation. Aggression is motivating and dopamine plays a crucial role in the rewards it offers. Autistic children, who cannot understand social language, irony and metaphor, and lack capacity for empathy, all mediated by the right frontal region, lack prosodic skill, the ability to convey meaning and feeling through intonation and inflection of the voice. It is the right hemisphere that mediates spontaneous facial expressions in reaction to humor or other emotions, including smiling and laughter. It is also the right hemisphere that is responsible for the peculiarly human ability to express sadness through tears. The left half of the face, or hemiface, which is controlled by the right hemisphere, is more involved in emotional expression. Emotions are also more strongly perceived when expressed by the left hemiface, and, intriguingly, the left hemiface is also larger than the right in right-handers. Although facial expression of emotion is a human universal, there are, inevitably, differences in facial expression across cultures, and because of the very fact that the left hemiface displays more complex emotional information, being able to convey mixed feelings, it seems that it may be easier in cross-cultural situations for people to read the relatively simple information conveyed by the right hemiface. This specialization of the right hemisphere for emotion is a process which begins in pre-human species. Chimpanzees and some other non-human primates show, just as we do, right hemisphere specialization for facial expression of emotions. The right hemisphere's affinity for both the perception and expression of emotion appears to be confirmed by the strong universal tendency to cradle infants with their faces to the left, so that they fall within the principal domain of attention of the adult's right hemisphere, and they are exposed to the adult's own more emotionally expressive left hemiface. This preference is known to go back at least 2,000 to 4,000 years, and even left-handed mothers display the leftward cradling bias. In fact, even chimpanzees and gorillas show the same leftward bias for cradling their infants. Differences in emotional affinity. It is the right hemisphere which gives emotional value to what is seen, a topic I will return to later, in considering the way in which the hemispheres influence the meaning we find in the experiential world. In the absence of a functioning right hemisphere, our world and ourselves become emotionally impoverished. The right frontal lobe plays a supremely important part in personality, in who we fundamentally are. Nonetheless, the left hemisphere does play a role in the understanding and expression of emotion. What are the differences? It seems, for a start, that the left hemisphere specializes in more superficial, social emotions, by contrast with the right hemisphere, which is more directly in touch with primary process emotionality. Related to this, the left hemisphere may also be more involved in conscious representation of emotion, willed, or forced, emotional expressions, once again principally of the mouth area, are controlled by the left hemisphere. A study on conscious and unconscious processing of emotional facial expression has suggested that the left but not the right amygdala is associated with explicit representational content of the observed emotion, whereas the right amygdala is more closely involved with unconscious emotional processing. It has to be said that, though it is involved with emotion, the left hemisphere remains, by comparison with the right, emotionally relatively neutral, something which is evidenced by its affinity for non-emotional, abstract paintings. Emotional stimuli are not incorporated into mood, not adopted personally, when offered to the left hemisphere rather than the right. The whole business seems more conscious, more willed, more deliberate, and that is in keeping with the left hemisphere's need to influence and manipulate, as well as its role in representing experience. In alexithymia, a condition of lack of awareness or capacity to express emotional arousal in words, the problem arises from an inability of the emotionally aware right hemisphere, which can be shown to be experiencing emotional arousal, to communicate it to the left hemisphere. The literature also suggests that there may be differences in the emotional timbre of the hemispheres, and this is a complex area. Old ideas that the right hemisphere was concerned with so-called negative emotions and the left hemisphere with positive emotions are not substantiated. A prevailing theory is that right hemisphere emotions are those of withdrawal, and left hemisphere emotions those of approach. Neither seems to me very satisfactory. Some broad agreement exists that the right hemisphere is more in tune with sadness, and less with anger, than the left hemisphere, and that what we call positive emotions rely on both. While the right hemisphere is associated with positive affect in many cases, and may even be the principal source of pleasurable experience, it is in general the left hemisphere that tends to take a more optimistic view of the self and the future. In fact, there is evidence, which I shall come to, that it may take an unwarranted optimistic view. Once again, the right hemisphere's range is more inclusive, as it can deal with either, and the left hemisphere's more partial. It seems to me a possibility that those emotions which are related to bonding and empathy, whether we call them positive or negative, are preferentially treated by the right hemisphere, as one would expect. Such stimuli capture right hemisphere attention. By the same token, those to do with competition, rivalry and individual self-belief, positive or negative, would be preferentially treated by the left hemisphere. Another thought-provoking detail about sadness and the right hemisphere involves the perception of color. Brain regions involved in conscious identification of color are probably left-sided, perhaps because it involves a process of categorization and naming. However, it would appear that the perception of color in mental imagery under normal circumstances activates only the right fusiform area, not the left, and imaging studies, lesion studies and neuropsychological testing all suggest that the right hemisphere is more attuned to color discrimination and perception. Within this, though, there are hints that the right hemisphere prefers the color green and the left hemisphere prefers the color red, as the left hemisphere may prefer horizontal orientation, and the right hemisphere vertical, a point I shall return to in considering the origins of written language in Chapter 8. The color green has traditionally been associated not just with nature, innocence and jealousy but with melancholy. She pined in thought, and with a green and yellow melancholy, she sat like Patience on a monument, smiling at grief. Is there some connection between the melancholy tendencies of the right hemisphere and the medieval belief that the left side of the body was dominated by black bile? Black bile was, of course, associated with melancholy, literally, Greek melon, black chole, bile, and was thought to be produced by the spleen, a left-sided organ. For the same reasons the term spleen itself was, from the 14th century to the 17th century, applied to melancholy, though, as if intuiting that melancholy, passion, and sense of humor all came from the same place. In fact, the right hemisphere, associated with the left side of the body, spleen could also refer to each or any of these. The issue of the relationship between depressive illness and the right hemisphere is complex. Here more than anywhere one has to take into account the influence of the anterior, posterior, front, back, axis of the brain, as well as the right, left axis. It seems that the polarity of emotional timbre between the two hemispheres is specifically tied to the most highly and lately evolved, most human parts of the brain, the frontal lobes. Left anterior lesions are associated with depression, and right anterior lesions associated with undue cheerfulness. The closer the left hemisphere lesion lies to the frontal pole, the greater the depressive symptomatology. For those with right hemisphere lesions the converse is true, the more caudal, the further back, the lesion, the greater the chance of depression. This confluence of evidence suggests that the right frontal pole has a depressive stance compared with either the left frontal pole or its own parietal occipital cortex. Depression per se is probably associated with reduced right posterior activity in addition to increased right frontal activity in most cases, although as one might predict threat monitoring is a right posterior activity. There is evidence of left hemisphere overactivity in mania, the polar opposite of depression, and this may also obtain in other mammals. Lesion studies confirm the relationship between activity of the right frontal lobe and depression, and neuroimaging studies also suggest a correlation between left frontal hypofunction and depression. Greater right than left activation is related to depressed mood. Specifically, increased electrical activity in the right prefrontal region is a marker of depression, and the majority of EEG studies also confirm left frontal hypoactivation. In normal subjects, relative right-sided EEG activation at rest predicts greater experience of negative affect. Subjects with relatively greater left frontal activation at rest may be able quickly to terminate their reaction, while subjects with right frontal activation may lack the requisite coping skills to minimize the duration of the negative affective response. Depressives relatively favor the left visual field and make more eye movements to the left in ways that have been validated to suggest right hemisphere activation. Confirmatory evidence comes from treatment for depression. The decreased left anterior functioning found in depression remits, as expected, with the illness. Where the blood flow in the left anterior frontal region is initially more sharply decreased, this predicts a better response to antidepressants. Depression is less likely to resolve or respond to treatment where there are irreversible lesions in the left hemisphere, but not other brain areas. There is also evidence that the types of depression experienced in right posterior hypoactivity are different from those experienced in left frontal hypoactivity, in ways which are in keeping with the views of the worlds that the two hemispheres bring into being. Thus, depression resulting from damage to the right hemisphere has more of indifference or apathy, a global, vague lifelessness, in contrast to the anxious, disturbed depression, accompanied by biological features, resulting from lesions to the left hemisphere. The sort of anxiety that accompanies depressed mood, and could be induced by reading a sad narrative, is known as anxious arousal, and shows greater lateralization to the right hemisphere. By contrast, anxious apprehension, based as it is on a fear of uncertainty and lack of control, preoccupations of the left hemisphere, is accompanied by preferential left hemisphere activation. In interpreting all neuroimaging studies of emotion, one should bear in mind the strictures of Jake Panksepp, probably the world's most distinguished neuroscientist of affect and emotion, that we are more likely to be imaging the areas associated with the cognitive content of an affective state than those associated with a precognitive affective state itself. Reason versus rationality. Despite the right hemisphere's overwhelmingly important role in emotion, the popular stereotype that the left hemisphere has a monopoly on reason, like the view that it has a monopoly on language, is mistaken. As always, it is a question not of what, but of in what way. In fact, reasoning is of different kinds, and though linear, sequential argument is clearly better executed by the left hemisphere, some types of reasoning, including deduction, and some types of mathematical reasoning, are mainly dependent on the right hemisphere. More explicit reasoning is underwritten by the left hemisphere, less explicit reasoning, such as is often involved in problem solving, including scientific and mathematical problem solving, by the right hemisphere. There is a relation between the pleasurable aha phenomenon of insight and the right amygdala, which mediates interactions between emotions and higher frontal cognitive function. In fact, an extensive body of research now indicates that insight, whether mathematical or verbal, the sort of problem solving that happens when we are, precisely, not concentrating on it, is associated with activation in the right hemisphere, mainly in the right anterior temporal area, specifically in the right anterior superior temporal gyrus, though where there are high levels of restructuring involved, there is also activity in the right prefrontal cortex. Insight is also a perception of the previous incongruity of one's assumptions, which links it to the right hemisphere's capacity for detecting an anomaly. Problem solving, making reasonable deductions, and making judgments may become harder if we become conscious of the process, thus rendering one's thought processes explicit, or analyzing a judgment, may actually impair performance, because it encourages the left hemisphere's focus on the explicit, superficial structure of the problem. The evidence is that mathematical skills are divided between the hemispheres. Some studies have shown mathematical performance to be impaired worse in children and in adults with left hemisphere than with right hemisphere damage. However, in another study, left hemisphere damaged children were significantly poorer only at written language, while right hemisphere damaged children performed worse on written language, reading and maths. The right hemisphere clearly does play a role in arithmetical calculations, and, in general, mathematical calculations activate more strongly on the right. Addition and subtraction activate the right parietal lobe, whereas multiplication activates verbal remembrance of times tables in the left hemisphere. Calculating prodigies appear to use more right hemisphere-dependent strategies, making use of episodic memory. The right hemisphere appears to be crucially involved in the process of deductive reasoning, a process which is independent not only of left hemisphere language areas, but also of right hemisphere visuospatial areas. For example, even in the absence of any correlated visual input, that is, where problems are presented acoustically via headphones, different types of reasoning problems evoke activity in the right superior parietal cortex and bilaterally in the precuneus. That the precuneus is involved is in itself interesting, because the precuneus, a center that lies deep inside the parietal lobe, is deeply connected both with emotion, it forms part of the limbic system, and the sense of the self. It is one of the brain's most consistently hot spots, with a high resting metabolic rate, and it goes quiet in altered states of consciousness where the sense of self is no longer active, such as sleep, anesthesia and vegetative states. It seems to play an important role in episodic memory, which is critical for personal identity, and in adopting the first-person perspective. And in fact, deductive logic is also associated with the right ventromedial prefrontal area of the brain, an area known to be devoted to emotion and feeling. Seeing what follows from a social, emotional understanding of the situation in which one finds oneself in the real world is at least as important, then, as seeing what follows from an abstract proposition. One finding that might seem at first sight unexpected, but the full significance of which will become apparent only in the next chapter, is that it is the right hemisphere that has the intuitive sense of numbers and their relative size. However, the sense is approximate and does not have precision. The left hemisphere, by contrast, has precision, but it has no intuitive sense of what it is actually doing, other than following rules and manipulating symbols. If one acquires a computational skill leading to a precise answer, it will be most evident in the language in which it was acquired. There is no such language effect in relation to inexact estimation, the intuitive sense of size. It is worth considering that numbers can either signify absolutes, a quantifiable amount, as in statistics, which would suggest an affinity with the left hemisphere, or signify relations, which would suggest an affinity with the right hemisphere. For Pythagoras, it was this regularity of proportion or relationship, rather than number in any absolute sense, that underpinned music and beauty, the music of the spheres, the natural harmony of the universe. The twin bodies. Emotion is inseparable from the body in which it is felt, and emotion is also the basis for our engagement with the world. Social understanding in the sense of empathic connection, as well as understanding how others feel, what they mean not only by what they say in context, as we have seen, but by their facial expressions, their body language and tone of voice, all this is made possible by the right hemisphere. In keeping with its capacity for emotion, and its predisposition to understand mental experience within the context of the body, rather than abstracting it, the right hemisphere is deeply connected to the self as embodied. Although each side of the brain has both motor and sensory connections with the opposite side of the body, we know that the left hemisphere carries an image only of the contralateral, right, side of the body. When the right hemisphere is incapacitated, the left part of the individual's body virtually ceases to exist for that person. It is only the right parietal lobe that has a whole body image. Importantly, this body image is not just a picture. It is not a representation, as it would be if it were in the left hemisphere, or just the sum of our bodily perceptions, or something imagined, but a living image, intimately linked to activity in the world, an essentially affective experience, which is why disturbances in it lead to profoundly disturbing illnesses, such as body dysmorphia and anorexia nervosa. More than this, the right and left hemispheres see the body in different ways. The right hemisphere, as one can tell from the fascinating changes that occur after unilateral brain damage, is responsible for our sense of the body as something we live, something that is part of our identity, and which is, if I can put it that way, the phase of intersection between ourselves and the world at large. For the left hemisphere, by contrast, the body is something from which we are relatively detached, a thing in the world, like other things, devitalized, a corpse. As Gabriel Marcel puts it, it is sometimes as if I am my body, sometimes as if I have a body. Some languages, such as German, see the body in these two senses as so distinct that they have different words for them, Leib for the first, Körper for the second. Incidentally, the German word Körper, related to the English corpse, came into the language through medicine and theology, the body there being the element left when the soul departed. The word Leib, related to Leben lebendig, English live, alive, referred to the bodies that survived a battle, those who were not Körper. In fact, even more striking is that the Greek word which subsequently came to indicate the body considered separately from the person, soma, is never used in Homer to refer to the living body, only to a corpse. The left hemisphere appears to see the body as an assemblage of parts. Remember the patient of Aaron Walls, whose body became rectilinear, compartmentalized, inanimate and hollow, an assemblage of scaffolding, following a right hemisphere stroke. If the right hemisphere is not functioning properly, the left hemisphere may actually deny having anything to do with a body part that does not seem to be working according to the left hemisphere's instructions. Patients will report that the hand doesn't belong to me, or even that it belongs to the person in the next bed, or speak of it as if made of plastic. One patient complained that there was a dead hand in his bed. A male patient thought the arm must belong to a woman in bed with him. A white woman thought hers belonged to one petty nigger in bed with her. Another complained that there was a child in the bed, on his left. Yet another was convinced that the nurses had bundled up his arm with the dirty laundry and sent it away to be washed. One patient believed quite firmly that the paralyzed arm belonged to her mother, though in all other respects her conversation was quite normal. The process in her case was, typically reversed by inhibiting the left hemisphere, by a process called vestibular stimulation. Examiner, whose arm is this? Patient, it's not mine. Whose is it? It's my mother's. How on earth does it happen to be here? I don't know, I found it in my bed. How long has it been there? Since the first day. Feel, it's warmer than mine. The other day too, when the weather was colder, it was warmer than mine. So where is your left arm? Patient, makes an indefinite gesture forwards, it's under there. Immediately after vestibular stimulation, inhibiting the left hemisphere, the examiner asks the patient to show him her left arm. Patient, points to her own left arm, here it is. Examiner, raises the patient's left arm, is this arm yours? Why, yes. Where is your mother's arm? Patient, hesitates, it is somewhere about. Where exactly? I don't know, perhaps here, under the bedclothes. She looks to her right, under the bedclothes. 2 hours after vestibular stimulation, the patient is questioned again. Examiner, points to the patient's left arm, whose arm is this? Patient, it's my mother's, it's warmer. Where is your left arm? The patient stares silently at the examiner. 1 hour and a half later, she spontaneously addresses the examiner. Patient points to her left arm, My mother's arm is colder than it was this morning. Feel how cold it is. On the following morning, the examiner asks the patient again, whose arm is this, while pointing to it. It's my mother's. It's pretty warm. I found it here. She forgot it when she was discharged from the hospital. After vestibular stimulation performed according to the same procedure used the day before, the examiner raises the patient's left arm and asks once again whose arm it is. Patient touches her left arm. It's mine. Where is your mother's arm? It must be here, in the corner. She looks for her mother's arm under the bedclothes without finding it. It's pretty warm. It is a strong arm. My mother was a laundress. This is known as a Samba Dog Lucia, and it often follows right hemisphere stroke. A lack of capacity to recognize parts of the embodied self is always associated with right hemisphere damage, never with left hemisphere damage. The phenomenon can be replicated by selectively anesthetizing the right hemisphere. It can also give rise to the belief that the affected part is under alien control. A patient described by Jean Lermite showed no concern and was positively euphoric. Despite being paralyzed down his left side, it seemed as if the entire left-hand side of his body had disappeared from his consciousness and from his psychic life. 3 days later, however, this patient reports that from time to time an alien hand, which disturbs and annoys him, comes and places itself on his chest. He says, "This hand presses on my tummy and chokes me. This hand bothers me," he says again. "It doesn't belong to me, and I'm afraid it might thump me." He thought it might belong to the man in the next bed. Another patient came to believe that the left side of his body was evil and controlled by external agents, perhaps by the devil in collusion with his dead father. There is greater proprioceptive awareness in the right hemisphere than the left. That is to say, the right hemisphere knows better than the left, without having to look, where for example the contralateral hand is and what position it adopts, even though that favors the left hand in right-handers. The right hemisphere is far more closely linked to the physiological changes that occur in the body when we experience emotion. The right hemisphere's superiority in the emotional realm is explicitly linked to this close physiological relationship with the body. This is a further reason why we hold babies to the left. The emotional impact of touch, the most basic and reciprocal mode of interaction, is also more direct and immediate if an infant is held to the left side of the body. Although studies of the effects of stroke on sexual function have shown it to be worse following left hemisphere stroke, this is confounded by depression, a common sequel of left hemisphere stroke. If depressed subjects are excluded, it appears to be more dependent on the right hemisphere. Interestingly, when there is right hemisphere damage, there appears to be a removal of the normal integration of self with body. The body is reduced to a compendium of drives that are no longer integrated with the personality of the body's owner. This can result in a morbid and excessive appetite for sex or food, which is out of keeping with the nature of the individual involved. I drew attention earlier to the fact that the right hemisphere is more intimately connected with the unconscious and automatic systems for regulating the body and its level of arousal. For example, through the autonomic control of heart rate or neuroendocrine function. There is one exception to this. There are two opponent processors within the autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic systems. There is some evidence that whereas sympathetic nervous control is more influenced by the right hemisphere, control of the parasympathetic nervous system is more under left hemisphere control. Of the two, the sympathetic is more important for modulating heart rate and blood pressure in response to emotion. It is also more involved with response to the new, the uncertain, and the emotionally demanding, the special domains of the vigilant right hemisphere, whereas the parasympathetic nervous system produces relaxation of autonomic function, appropriate to the familiar, the known and the emotionally more neutral, the special domains of the left hemisphere. But release of the left hemisphere can certainly increase activity inappropriately, and will be associated with sympathetic activity. Perhaps the safest conclusion is that this area remains unclear. Depth. 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 The equivalent of time in the visual realm could be thought of as spatial depth. Indeed, since Einstein, we have come to understand that time and space are aspects of one entity. As it is the right hemisphere that gives depth to our sense of time, in the visual realm it is the right hemisphere that gives us the means of appreciating depth in space, the way in which we stand in relation to others, rather than by categorization. The right hemisphere has a tendency to deal with spatial relations in terms of the degree of distance, which it can discriminate easily, in contrast with the strategy of the left hemisphere, which tends to be more categorical, above, below, and so on. There is a parallel here with the sense of time. Duration belongs to the right hemisphere, while sequencing, before, after equals above, below, belongs to the left. The right hemisphere's organization of space depends more on depth, whether things are nearer or further from me. The right hemisphere is even biased towards what lies further from me, an aspect of its broader, wider and deeper attention. The left hemisphere, by comparison, has difficulty with processing depth. As a result, it may get the size of things wrong, sometimes dramatically. Right hemisphere deficits cause difficulty in dealing with irregular, smoothly curved surfaces, such as are characteristic of living things, in 3 dimensions. Even though the capacity to deal with a predictable rectilinear 3D object like a cube is spared. It has been suggested that this problem in dealing with curved volumes may underlie prosopagnosia, and it might be a contributing factor. One of the features Boehmer's patients described was, after all, a lack of depth, the reduction of the face to a white oval plate. The right hemisphere tends to present the world realistically, with visual detail and in 3 dimensions, with depth, and an aesthetic sense of the intensity and beauty of visual representations comes largely from the right hemisphere. The right hemisphere represents objects as having volume and depth in space, as they are experienced. The left hemisphere tends to represent the visual world schematically, abstractly, geometrically, with a lack of realistic detail, and even in one plane. Drawings of buildings, in individuals with an inactivated right hemisphere, may even be laid out flat with all facades simultaneously visible, as in a child's drawing. One way of putting this is that the left hemisphere is concerned with what it knows, where the right hemisphere is concerned with what it experiences. A patient studied by Gazzaniga and Ledoux, who underwent a commissurotomy, could draw a cube normally with either hand prior to the operation, but following the procedure could draw only a poor diagram with his favored right hand, though the left hand was able to draw a 3-dimensional construct of a cube.